online at booktv.org. Now on Book TV, Bartholomew Sparrow talks about his biography of former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and discusses the role played by General Scowcroft in national security and diplomatic affairs over his 30-year government career. This event is about an hour and a half.
Yes. I don't know. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar. And for those of you who don't know, the seminar is a joint project of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. My name is Eric Arneson from George Washington University, and I am the co-chair on behalf of the National History Center of this seminar. As is our custom, I want to thank two people whose behind-the-scenes efforts makes this seminar possible on a weekly basis, Amanda Moniz and Pete Bierstecker. It's their logistical work that allows us to pull this off. I would also like to express thanks to Schaefer, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, whose generous financial contributions support this seminar's activities. Today's speaker is Bartholomew Sparrow, who is a professor of government at the University of Texas. He is the author of multiple works, including From the Outside In, the World War II and the American State, The Insular Cases and the Emergence of American Empire, and Uncertain Guardians, the News Media as a Political Institution. Professor Sparrow has been a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow and a Joan Shorenstein Center Fellow as well, and he is the recipient of the Leonard D. White Award and the Franklin L. Burdett Pi Sigma Alpha Award from the American Political Science Association. Today, he will be talking on his new book, which has been published by Public Affairs Press, and it's called The Strategist, Brent Scowcroft, and the Call of National Security. Professor Sparrow.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. A friend in Washington is someone who stabs you in the chest. This is one of Scowcroft's jokes, and the irony is he's someone who has many friends and is well admired and adored, and if not adored, in Washington. It's good to be back here at the Wilson Center and to be speaking under the auspices of the National History Center. My time here in 2009 as a resident fellow was invaluable for making this project possible, and I benefited greatly from the intellectual environment, from the many speakers and symposia, and from talking to and learning from the other researchers, the administrators, and the staff. I'd like to thank Christian Osterman, Roger Lewis, and the others who made this possible, Amanda Moniz and Pete Bierstecker in particular. Incidentally, when I first considered what I would title the biography, there were a few books called The Strategist. In the meantime, 3 books have been published with the very same title. One is a police procedural, another is a financial thriller, and a third is advice on how to be the leader your business needs. So much for planning. What is interesting, though, is that few in Washington and around the country let me start over. What is interesting, though, is that many in Washington and around the country don't think of Brent Scowcroft as a strategist, but merely as one of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford's advisors, as National Security Advisor to Ford and George H.W. Bush, and as a longtime Washington insider. So for some, the title may ring counterintuitively. And if he is not a strategist in the sense of a Sun Tzu or a Karl von Clausewitz, neither is he an abstract theorist in the manner of a Walt Rostow and his claims in The Stages of Growth and Anti-Communist Manifesto, a world analyst even in the manner of Henry Kissinger's sweeping arguments in World Order. In fact, several of my interviewees, including a former Secretary of Defense and National Security Advisor, told me they didn't especially think of Brent Scowcroft as a strategist, with one former official saying he regarded Scowcroft as operating between the 40-yard lines. Yet those who have worked with Scowcroft most closely, U.S. and foreign policy officials alike, including Helmut Kohl, have spoken admiringly of Scowcroft's strategic sense. It's just that he has kept his abilities as a strategist largely out of view, with a few exceptions. One has been his op-eds, most notably that in August 2002, in the Wall Street Journal, enjoining the George W. Bush administration not to rush to war against Iraq. And while Scowcroft has written about 100 op-eds over the course of 4 decades, almost all of them went out of office, these provide only a piecemeal and periodic glimpse of him as a strategist. His strategic vision is further revealed in co-authored commission and study reports, but these too are focused on specific topics and limited by their short length. Even in his co-authored books, Scowcroft has received second billing, perhaps because of the tyranny of the alphabet, repression that many of us have experienced. There have also been published interviews with him and of journal articles he has written. Despite these writings, Scowcroft's own global vision has not been visible on the order of a George Kennan, a Richard Nixon, a Henry Kissinger, or a Zbigniew Brzezinski. At least not yet, I might add. This is where the publication of his memoirs will help, since I understand he'll be focusing on his philosophy and worldview. Brent Scowcroft will work discreetly instead, almost always behind the scenes, whether in small groups, one-on-one, or in closed meetings. Of particular significance has been Scowcroft's relationship with the former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Kissinger, with whom he worked closely after Nixon's reelection and then once Ford took office. The two collaborated on almost all policy decisions between 1973 and 1977, a period in which Kissinger calls Scowcroft his, quote, full partner, unquote. Yet because this partnership took place almost entirely behind doors, it has gone unnoticed by almost all journalists, diplomatic historians, and others who have written on the national security policy of the Nixon and Ford administration. But as Vice President Ford's tutor on foreign policy in the months before Nixon's resignation, and as someone whose agenda was only that of the President and the United States, General Scowcroft, in fact, became President Ford's most trusted foreign policy advisor. The Reagan administration then brought in Scowcroft to resolve the MX missile controversy and later to serve on the 3-person Tower Board to investigate the Iran-Contra scandal. He subsequently became George Bush's right-hand man and in early 2001 helped George W. Bush with U.S.-China relations and intelligence reform, advice on the latter issue that went mostly unheeded. He later worked quietly with Bush 43's foreign policy team in their second term in office and has occasionally given foreign policy advice to the Obama White House, especially early in the administration. A few specific examples of his sense of strategy. With the British pound collapsing in 1976 and with Secretary of State Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon at loggerheads, Scowcroft stepped in and quietly worked out an arrangement for concessions by Britain's Prime Minister Callaghan's Labour government for a $4 billion IMF rescue package backed by the United States and supported by Germany and France, a great deal of money at the time. And the trick here was the pound was sinking, it was under pressure, and they had to keep these whole extensive sets of negotiations secret away from the press so it didn't provoke a further run on the pound. Another was Scowcroft's advice to President Bush early in 1989 that the United States and the Soviet Union both withdraw their ground forces from Central Europe. His logic was that NATO minus the U.S., in comparison to the Warsaw Pact minus the USSR, would be to the United States' net advantage and would take the initiative away from Mikhail Gorbachev. Although the idea provoked a firestorm, especially from Defense Secretary Cheney, Bush eventually agreed to back a scaled-back version of the plan. Rather than belligerently demand that the wall be torn down, Scowcroft and his NSC staff wanted to create the underlying conditions that would make the Berlin Wall no longer necessary, so it would fall of its own accord. More significantly, Scowcroft, Bush, and Baker wanted to take the initiative away from Gorbachev to think through where they wanted to go and what they wanted to achieve, militarily, strategically, economically, and then to provide a set of carrots and sticks that would induce the Soviets to agree. which also often meant getting the UK, France, and Germany to agree. A third example was his decision on the Scowcroft Commission and later under Bush 41 to push through radical reductions in nuclear missiles and to reduce the number of MIRV warheads and to reconvert or to download to single warhead ICBMs. Scowcroft's argument, and one that gradually prevailed, was that MIRV rockets with up to 10 warheads were both more attractive as targets and more attractive as weapons that could be used in contrast to single warhead ICBMs. In fact, this is some of the logic that infused START and START II. Other bold moves as a strategist were his insistence that Iraq have to leave Kuwait, the first one in the administration to really insist on this point and convinced Bush and others in short order. And his call for prudence with respect to attacking Iraq after 9/11, as I've mentioned, and his willingness to support the troop surge after 2007. So what has allowed Brent Scowcroft to exert such an enduring influence on national security policy? So much so that for years he's been one of the most admired, if not the most admired, elder statesmen in Washington. One is his ability to keep his eyes on the ball, on the United States' longer-term interest, military, political, economic, whether in his capacity as an Air Force lieutenant colonel, as military assistant to the president, as deputy national security advisor, or as national security advisor proper. Yet this ability to look down the road would be of little use without the ability to see the moving parts, to anticipate other vehicles, upcoming curves, the obstructions ahead. As a student of world history and international relations, as a graduate of the Armed Forces Staff College and National War College, with a doctorate in international relations from Columbia, and as a professor at West Point and then the Air Force Academy, he has been able to analyze the forces in play, to get a feel for their tendencies and trajectories, and to gauge their possible effects. Like a skilled chess player, Scowcroft has been very good at seeing the pieces on the board and figuring out how the opposing player or players might respond. These were characteristics honed under the tutelage of Air Force Major General Richard Yudkin, also a defense intellectual and one of the developers of the Single Integrated Operations Plan, SIOP. And then while in the Pentagon, Yudkin helped Scowcroft learn how the government operated and how the different bureaucracies interacted with research communities, with industry and scientific communities and other actors. Later, working under Kissinger, Scowcroft further honed his sense of the international system and became more comfortable working with the press. All the same, a strategist has to be relevant. One could be a superb strategist, whether as a military planner, campaign consultant, or analyst of current events, but if he or she is on the sidelines and his or her ideas are ignored, that person can't be really considered a strategist. Kennan is renowned for his long telegram and Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Yet after this white-hot burst of influence, policymakers essentially ignored him for the next 5 decades while he was at Princeton and on his Pennsylvania farm. Neither do we really think of him as a strategist over the later period. Rather, it's for that earlier period. Another aspect of strategy is operational then, where it is hard to think of any other policymaker in recent times who has been as consistently influential and well respected for his judgment and expertise. I was one slide behind, excuse me. This trust has distinct roots. One is Scowcroft's multivocality, that is his ability to speak credibly to several distinct audiences, thanks to his range of expertise and experience in international relations, in nuclear weapons, in military affairs, in intelligence, and in economics. Furthermore, not only can Scowcroft speak authoritatively on these separate issues, he's also able to consider how they intersect and interact. Another is his drive, coupled with his ability. One comment his superior officers made repeatedly in their efficiency ratings was his ability to keep growing with no discernible upper ceiling. He would have clearly received a 4th star, as had Alexander Haig and Colin Powell, had he not retired from the Air Force when he became National Security Advisor in November 1975. A third is his cordial and respectful personality. Another frequent comment his superior officers made was how easy he was to work with. He impressed his Air Force bosses not only with his initiative and willingness to go the extra mile, but his ability to be a team player, even if the ultimate decisions didn't go his own way. He has strong, well-informed views, but he's willing to be persuaded by new evidence and strong argument. He listens. As one Bush administration colleague put it, Scowcroft doesn't want anything. He can be very serious, reserved, and compartmentalized. He's also affable, he teases, and he used to play pranks on his colleagues. He had a very good sense of humor and was not above making off-color jokes. He got along well with others and had a good sense of how to pitch his remarks, whether to associates, reporters, academics, military officers, foreign leaders, students, or young people. Some implications of the subtitle, Brent Scowcroft and the Call of National Security. I should say that it feels odd to be writing about the life of about someone who still participates in politics and still runs his own business. He was just in Saudi Arabia for the King Abdullah's funeral. Of course, there are many biographies of presidential candidates and other prominent political figures who are still very much with us, so the question becomes, do their lives merit this attention, however provisional at this stage? And here I can unequivocally say yes. To the first part of my subtitle, the name Brent Scowcroft. As a biography, I wanted to examine and present Scowcroft's roots. This research led me to his background as a member of a very well-established family. Job Pingree, Brent Scowcroft's great-grandfather, was one of the captains of the Mormon companies making the overland trek from what is now part of Omaha to the Great Salt Lake Basin. Another, Richard Ballantyne, was also a captain of a Mormon company, a missionary in India, and the founder of the Mormon Sunday schools. Both he and Pingree were polygamists. A third great-grandfather, John Scowcroft, arrived later by train and founded a very successful company of food and dry goods wholesale merchants, helped by the fact that Ogden was an entrepot for rail traffic throughout the West, where freight trains had to change engines and where passengers had to switch from Union Pacific to Central Pacific trains or vice versa when traveling east to west. You can't go anywhere without coming to Ogden, town leaders boasted. During Prohibition, Al Capone is reported to have said that Ogden was too rough for him. Scowcroft's father managed the family business, and he was close to both his father and mother, and by all accounts had a happy and active childhood, the youngest of 3 children and the only son. And with his sisters being 4 and 7 years older, he was in some ways an only child. Acknowledging that he never heard his parents fighting, he rightly commented that his experience growing up gave him a distorted sense of his fellow humans. Now, this is all very fine, one might say, but what do these pleasant stories and nice family photos have to do with Scowcroft as an Air Force officer, presidential advisor, business consultant, and senior statesman? What they convey is just how secure Scowcroft was growing up. Secure materially, secure socially, and secure psychologically. He had no status anxiety, in other words, and he wasn't because of a sense of deprivation or other contrarian impulse that motivated him to leave Ogden for West Point and then join the Army Air Corps. But this is him, I'll put him out as he's here. But this very sense of security would then make the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the travails of the U.S. Military Academy, and his 2 years in military hospitals following the near-fatal crash of his North American aviation Mustang at the age of 24, that much more searing. Then, barely a month after the crash, he received word that his father died of a heart attack at the age of 57. Lying in hospital beds and thinking about the future, he decided he didn't want to be in the family business and wanted to study and to be in a position to influence national security policy. The fact that the Strategist's biography has a further implication. Biography, as one political scientist writes, provides no explicit conceptual framework for the selection, organization, and presentation of data. This makes it tough to study someone who didn't write things down oftentimes, who does not boast of his own achievements, and whose records were only partially available. So I consulted what archival and oral history sources I could, read the many histories and inside accounts of U.S. national security policy, individual presidents and presidential administrations, and research and journalism on particular people, issues, regions, and countries. But in order to bring perspective to the documents, news reporting, scholarly analyses, and Scowcroft's own behavior, I also conducted 40 interviews with the general and more than 100 other interviews with his colleagues, associates, friends, and relatives. To an extent, biography is an exercise in imagination, as John Lewis Gaddis has commented. That is, the biographer tries to envision being in someone else's world. Fully capturing that vision is a fool's errand, to be sure. But just as surely it is possible to be as accurate and thorough as possible and to be fair. Being fair means not just selecting the positive, as some biographers do, or the negative, as other biographers do, but describing and then interpreting the subject's thoughts and actions as well as one can, and rendering them in light of his or her personal and political circumstances. The final portion of the subtitle, The Call of National Security, refers to Scowcroft's vocation, his call to military service, whenever since the age of 12 he read a brand new book, West Point Today, and he decided he wanted to go to West Point. He would serve as commandant of the Ogden High School ROTC, attend the U.S. Military Academy Prep School at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, and then go to West Point. He would then come back to teach 5 years later, serve as Associate Department Chair and Department Chair at the Air Force Academy. This sense of vocation carried Scowcroft through the harrowing experience of West Point, the horrible plane crash, and the painful death of his father. And so he would dedicate himself to the Air Force, the White House, and several presidents and their administrations, as well as to other purposes, such as studying and writing reports for presidential and other commissions, and working with the Aspen Strategy Group, the Atlantic Council, and the Council of Foreign Relations, and other bodies. He also had to dedicate himself to caring for his wife, who had type 2 diabetes. It was in large part because of this care he would dash home to the hospital or wherever, the home or to the hospital at all hours, then come back to work, and then get back to work at 6 the next morning. And it was because he would fall asleep that Bush 41 was not in the least annoyed when he'd doze off, only to wake up and recover as though nothing had happened, which was the origin of the Scowcroft Award. Other objectives to which he dedicated himself were serving as President's personal emissary to countries such as the Soviet Union, China, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, and Great Britain for the discussion of particularly sensitive issues, being an honest broker as national security advisor, working as a business consultant from 1977 until 1988, and then from 1994 through the present, and agreeing to serve as chair or co-chair of blue ribbon commissions and study groups. So what important elements or aspects to the biography are not implicated in the book's title and subtitle? One is perhaps the momentous history of which Scowcroft was a part. He played a key role, sometimes the key role, in many of the chief events in U.S. national security policy of the last 40 years. I devote 22 of the 31 chapters to Scowcroft's actions in the White House or as an advisor to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. For these chapters, I had two decision rules. One was to focus on a few principal events, such as the U.S. evacuation of Saigon, and the development of U.S.-China relations, the Tower Board's investigation of the Iran-Contra scandal, the lead-up to and implementation of the 1991 Gulf War, and the decision to attack Iraq in 2003, where many of his former colleagues and friends and allies were working for George W. Bush. But I also wanted to focus on Scowcroft's role in other important, if less well-known ways, such as the reform of the intelligence community after the disclosure of the CIA's family jewels in 1974, the 1976 Korean tree incident, the U.S. government and IMS rescued the collapsing pound in the 70s that I mentioned, why Condoleezza Rice, after 9/11, departed from the example set by her mentor and friend when she said she wanted to follow, and how Scowcroft's role and Scowcroft's role in pioneering the development that high-ranking government officials turned to international business consulting after serving in office, a niche, or rather niches, that didn't effectively exist in the 70s. The other decision rule for these chapters was to be as definitive as possible, given the archival records now available, even if some have not yet been released, new scholarship by journalists, diplomatic historians, and political scientists, and the ability to interview many of the participants in these events. 7 of my interviewees have already passed. Here I wanted to condense the issues into short chapters, since most of these topics have been the subject of several or many books and articles, and to draw out Scowcroft's own role by using archival data, consulting secondary sources, and through interviews. Among the topics on which the book offers new perspectives are the evacuation of Vietnam in April '75 and the Mayaguez incident of early May that year, Scowcroft's performance as chair of the President's Commission on Strategic Forces, that is the Scowcroft Commission, By the way, in the middle of this, President Reagan announced his support for SDI when that wasn't the brief of his commission. The reasons behind the pause in U.S.-Soviet relations after Bush took office in 1989, what happened to U.S.-China relations in the months leading up to and then after Tiananmen Square, the rise and fall of the New World Order, the phrase used by the Bush administration in the lead up to the 1991 Persian Gulf War, and the other topics as well. The title also obscures misjudgments and mistakes, such as the mishandling of the Panama coup attempt of October 3, 1989, where Scowcroft admitted we were sort of Keystone cops. The relative neglect of Afghanistan and Pakistan after the Soviets pulled out, with disastrous longer-term consequences. Scowcroft also voiced regret over how the administration had handled the demise of Yugoslavia and had not been more proactive. Finally, the book title does not give a full sense of Scowcroft's internationalism. As an enlightened realist, which is what he called himself, he accepts the world as it is and believes the United States should work with existing powers, whether the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Arafat and the PLO, or Iran, in pursuit of common goals for the promotion of international stability. So how does a study of Scowcroft's life and his approach to national security policy inform us at present? A study of his career and the implicit comparison that makes with other national security advisors and other presidential administrations reveals several things. One is the importance of personnel and interpersonal chemistry in the White House, both between the president and his national security advisor and among the foreign policy principals. Scowcroft learned from the very difficult Nixon 40 years and from the Iran-Contra affair. Several things became apparent from his experiences. The NSC had to coordinate policymaking and not conduct foreign policy operations. The president and his principals had to be able to delegate responsibility for national security policymaking, which accordingly had to be closely coordinated. But this meant establishing trust and getting the buy-ins of the principals to their deputies' recommendations and vice versa. Furthermore, what Vietnam made glaringly apparent was that U.S. presidents and their staffs had to work carefully and closely with Congress and the press if they were to lead effectively. This meant visits with members of Congress and reporters, both individually and in groups. It meant public appearances. It meant orchestrating campaigns to pass legislation, sustain vetoes, approve nominees, and achieve other objectives. In fact, the Bush administration did quite well considering it had to work with Democratic majorities in both houses and a media and public tired of a third term of Republican presidency. A second lesson from a study of Scowcroft's career is his indirect approach. One of his characteristic ways of diffusing problems is to think about how to undermine their cause so the problems themselves dissipate, to make nuclear warfare unattractive as a military option for U.S. and Soviet officials both, to make the Berlin Wall no longer necessary by encouraging political and social reform in Eastern Europe, to give another example. The same principle would appear to apply to terrorism. Human and technological intelligence, drones, covert actions, and special operations may all be necessary, may all have their place, but there's also a place for addressing the conditions that make a particular view of Islam a viable option. Obviously, people have multiple loyalties, multiple attachments, and one kind of religion there are other views of Islam. There's certainly different, people are neighbors, people are nationals, people are seek employment, they seek, they're members of certain societies, and it seems that the society that hosts terrorists, when it becomes less hospitable, this is probably the best way to remove terrorism. In my lifetime, I certainly didn't imagine I would see the end of the IRA, the end of apartheid, or the end of the Soviet Union. But shifting politics, diplomacy, new public policies, and political leadership made them irrelevant. So I suspect that lessons can be learned. A third lesson concerns secrecy and accountability. When I asked General Scowcroft about Edward Snowden's leaks, he said he was against Snowden's revelations, quote, with every fiber in his body. This is what I expected, consistent with his long-term support for executive privilege, presidential discretion, and strong intelligence, whether human, signal, or covert. Yet he surprised me in the next breath by remarking that Snowden's leaks, and here we can presumably include WikiLeaks and the recent CIA report on torture, or the Senate report on CIA torture, might have a salutary impact by starting a constructive debate among members of Congress, the press, and the public about legislative oversight, the operations of the U.S. government, and democratic accountability. Indeed, both Snowden and the CIA torturers in the recent Senate report were contractors. Scowcroft believes in the United States. You might think this to be old-fashioned, but I suspect that his argument would be that recent U.S. actions detract from the United States soft power and erode Americans' belief in the government. Not only are the recent revelations a recipe for cynicism, but it reduces the legitimacy of the American government if presidents cannot make plausible claims of the United States being the leader of the free world, of the United States as the city on a hill, or the United States as a shining point of light. The subtext here is that the United States faces a very real crisis in government. Of record low approval ratings of the polls for Congress, the media, business, and other major societal actors, the turnout of eligible voters in the 2014 midterm elections, the lowest in 72 years, and that was in 1942, to help you with the math, when many voters were dislocated because of military service and the massive internal migration because of the revolutionized job market. And there's a feeling that the wars in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, as frightening as ISIS and al-Qaeda may be, are limitless. Well over half of Americans polled over the last 6 months disapprove of President Obama's foreign policy. In other words, there's a moral dimension to American politics that was very clear during the Cold War and clear, arguably, through the end of the Soviet Union and the first Gulf War that is now missing, a decline in U.S. soft power, if not in other aspects of American culture and society. This begs the question, then, of American grand strategy when there's still really not been anything to replace the containment of the Soviet Union. What is the United States for? Just against terrorism, extremism, ISIS, or some future group? What hope does the United States offer other peoples of the world, our children, our grandchildren? I'll leave you with those questions. Thank you.
We now have a healthy bit of time for questions and discussions. We would ask you to wait for the microphone before you begin to speak, and when you do, if you would identify yourself to the group. So we'll start right back here with Don.
Thank you, Bat, for that presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I was wondering, you sort of, in my mind, left a gap between when his plane crashed in World War II and when he took up as an officer in the Pentagon and so on. Did he have any other active military experience, or was that sort of the end of it as a soldier? Or?
No, he had a whole career. I mean, I say he could have gotten a 4th star. So he was put up for his 1st star when he was leaving the Pentagon and invited to become Nixon's military assistant, basically to oversee and handle the military operations of the White House, which basically includes the transportation, medicine, carpool, all the logistics, all the president's detail. And before that, he worked under Yudkin in the Pentagon for a number of years. He served in. He went to the Army War College, or National War College. He taught I mentioned he taught at West Point and in the Air Force Academy. He also served in Yugoslavia for 2 years as assistant air attaché, which was an intelligence post, and also as an air officer. And so he worked there, and actually he overlapped with Kennan a little bit, and Eagleburger would be there shortly thereafter. So he had a bunch of different positions. In fact, I think I talked about his multivocality earlier, and this is one of the things I think really helped his experience and repertoire of skills. Was like a large company, he kept being cycled around, and the Air Force was young enough and growing enough, because he went to West Point, right? He didn't go to the Air Force Academy, he wasn't around, and the Air Force was just established in ¡48, and so he really benefited from the fact that he was, as one person actually here at the Wilson Center said, he benefited from the fact that he had a 40-pound cranium, and that the Air Force was young and willing to tolerate someone who was who they saw his talent and brilliance, and or let him sort of write in his own ticket in a way that's hard to imagine now.
Yeah, the reason I laid that predicate is I just wanted to know whether he gave you an indication of how his exposure to actual combat situations shaped his own
He didn't
thinking.
no, this is what one of the anomalies about him is he never had any command experience outside of academic duties and his military attaché duties. So he never was in Korea, and this is kind of a regret. He never was in Vietnam, never in sort of Thailand or in West Germany. So yeah, never even commanded a missile base or an Air Force base here. So that also made him quite distinct.
In the back, right there behind Don. In the far back. Yes.
Thank you, Bob Hathaway here at the center. You obviously had a lot of access to Scowcroft. Can you tell us a bit about the kind of relationship you developed with him? To what extent do you think he was forthcoming? What did he not want to talk about? How much, if at all, did you have access to his personal papers? Can you give us a sense of how, over a period of time, your relationship with your subject developed?
Yeah, that's actually that's a nice question. Well, so right in the preface, it started out with he was a little bit suspicious of me. He hadn't heard of me, and so before I visited with him, he had a copy of my CV, and he wanted to. I prepared a short talk about why it was necessary that his life be recorded and be written, and argued that I could do this, and he agreed. So the relationship developed where I think there was sort of cordial and respectful throughout. Now, how forthcoming was he? And actually, let me just say that he was very generous. I mean, he not only allowed me to interview him about once a month, but people would, he would give me other names, or I had names, and sometimes I would ask him to make the entree, for example, to talk to Bush 41, or talk to Henry Kissinger, or to Dick Cheney, and they would call up his office and say, well, who's this Sparrow character? And he would say, well, blah, blah, blah. And so no doubt people were checking with him first before agreeing to talk to me. Having said that, for the most part, he was quite forthcoming. There were things that he said he forgot. There were things that he didn't remember. There are things on occasions where he would say, I can't talk about that. And things that he didn't want to talk about were his kind of current business for obvious reasons. As head of National Security Advisor, he's also overseeing the committee that plans and commissions covert actions. And so these things he didn't talk about. Other times, I would come back to issues. So he didn't want to talk about something, and I would come back to them. So several things I asked him repeatedly. So he was always very guarded, always very protective, and that's kind of consistent with him being very discreet, very behind the scenes, and so he was the opposite of voluble or discursive. Having said that, I kind of tried to get as much out of him as I could, and when I came back with questions with what other people said, or if there was a discrepancy in my understanding of something from the record or from my interviews, then I would say, well, look, I don't understand this, and what is going on here? And so it's kind of this this cumulative process, really, of trying to get more out of him. And I think as someone who's used to working on sensitive issues, it was, well, you show me what you know, and then I will tell you, how I can help you. So I kind of had to prove know enough, and he really didn't. Occasionally he would volunteer things, and more, of course, about his childhood or early years than later. But so we had a friendly relationship. We have a good relationship. But I think the fact that I'm a generation younger than he is, not in sort of Washington, in some ways maybe that helped me. But in some ways I think it wasn't as though. I remember reading an interview he did with at West Point for an oral history collection. And I was furious because there were some things he told this guy that he hadn't told me, and I was like, but also his energy and his and how he was feeling would vary. So sometimes he would be tired and not feeling so well, or there were different ailments over the course of about 5 years. I interviewed him, and sometimes he'd be more energetic, more upbeat, and more kind of cooperative. So it was a relationship. I have a friend who's just finishing a biography of Robert McNamara, and they had really had this antagonistic relationship. It was kind of, they would, he would insult my friend, and he would, say all sorts of things. It was all kind of in the open and very rough and tumble, and Scowcroft was the opposite, always very genteel and kind of reserved.
Right up here.
My name is Stephen Shore. Was Scowcroft ever considered for Secretary of State, or did he ever have any interest in that position?
Yes, that is yes about your question. No, he wasn't interested in Secretary of State. He thought he wanted to be Secretary of Defense under Bush 41, because even, I think, the first announcement I think that Bush made may have been upon his election was James Baker as Secretary of State, because they went back 30 years from Houston, and Bush had been by his side when Baker's first wife died, and they were old tennis partners, and so they had this long, very good relationship, and so that was his first appointment, and so that wasn't really on the table. So he was thinking about Secretary of Defense, but then the Bush and Baker persuaded him that National Security Advisor actually would be more important, and that he would have equal status with him in terms of NSC or other White House discussions. And even though he'd done it before, so at first it didn't hold much appeal to him, but then he thought, well, maybe this would be good, and then he realized that it really actually gave him a lot more power and more influence than he imagined, because he and Bush were just so close. I mean, a few months apart in age, and both had been pilots in the 40s, and both kind of the same kind of background.
Back here.
Thomas Julian, I teach nuclear history for the Air Force Institute of Technology. A question, you've mentioned General Yudkin, who was, I believe, an unrated officer in the Pentagon, something of a legend in his own right, though again not too well known. But I'm curious, did the name Wesley Posvar come into your discussions at all? Because Posvar, of course, was the head of the political science department at the Air Force Academy. I was down the hall in history.
Yeah.
And we were very jealous, I must say, of the influence they had. But the fact is, Posvar is not mentioned by you. He came from the military academy, I believe, and probably brought Scowcroft with him. What kind of influence was there?
Yeah, I didn't find much direct influence. He was actually at West Point when Scowcroft was there after he got his master's degree at Columbia. He was still doing graduate work, so he'd commute down to Morningside Heights. And Posvar was there. And then later on, it was because Posvar was going to go to Harvard to do some graduate work that they asked Scowcroft to come in and first serve as deputy chair and then department head at the political science department at Colorado Springs. So it was, he was there. They got along well, and I think they were friendly. I think Posvar then later left to head which university? You could probably Pittsburgh, yeah. And so. So yeah, he's mentioned. I didn't find a particularly strong relationship, but certainly it's there.
I'd like to ask a question, if I could, about the writing of a biography. And I think the challenges of writing a biography of someone who is living it poses a set of challenges that you don't have when the subject is not, in that they can reflect upon the work that you're doing and comment on it all along the way, but you also are able to ask follow-up questions. One job of a biographer is to faithfully speak to the historical record and to provide an account that is accurate, useful, for readers. But oftentimes biographers reflect more broadly on the visions, the character, the contributions of their characters that they're writing about. And here I sense that this is very much an admiring biography. And I'm wondering if you could offer us an example in the book, if there is, of where you step back and raise questions about either the judgment, the conclusions, or the strategies that this strategist put forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is mine. One of the things about the relationship as it developed is I certainly have some differences with Scowcroft, and some of those are in the book. But I certainly do like him and respect him, and so that was nice. I mean, to write about someone who I really held in contempt or didn't respect or what have you, that would not be much fun for spending years of your life. But I gave some examples when I talked about the misjudgments, about Yugoslavia. He'd had that record of Yugoslavia, and he actually thought he and Eagleburger had been there. What was he called? Lawrence of Macedonia was his name. It was called. So there was. I think they thought they knew more about Yugoslavia than the folks in the State Department and intelligence. And so I think they looked kind of at the evidence of Milosevic and what was going to happen, and kind of these brewing nationalists, separatists, whatever you want to call it, and that they didn't respond well to that. I also spend a half chapter on Afghanistan, and really you have kind of the blowback from Afghanistan that is in many ways kind of the root of the sort of the terrorism and of Al-Qaeda. And so I talk about kind of how they, after the billions of dollars in the years from Brzezinski and Carter to the Reagan administration to support the Mujahideen and to supply them with weapons and aids and funds to Pakistan, and Pakistan was then funneling to the different rebel groups, that once the Soviets leave, they kind of, Afghanistan's a ruins, its economy's a shell, there are all these refugees, there are all these wrecked towns from the Soviet actions as well as from the fighting, and so it's kind of this bywater now, and so that's an example. Another is I think they mishandled Alexander Solzhenitsyn's visit. They later, they thought, oh, this is too political. And I mean, one of the things that I think where Scowcroft is, he gets criticized for his caution, and that he's too guarded, always sees the downside, doesn't see the upside enough. And there's something to this. He's always aware of the pitfalls and what might happen, but he's also very nuanced and very analytic and very smart. He's not one, but most people want something a little more, quicker and more uplifting, something shorter. They want a song to sing, or as it were. And he and Baker and Bush weren't very good at this. And it was nothing like, tear down this wall or axis of evil, or these nice messages, these messages, but some sort of easy way to get a handle on this world that was happening. And I spend a good bit of time talking about this, is that with the Cold War ended, he's a little lost. I mean, that was his whole life. He'd been, he was there as a young teenager when Pearl Harbor happened, and then soon after that, of course, you have not soon, but a few years later, you have the gelling of the Cold War and how this really defined his career. And they and if they were reelected, I'm not sure what would have happened. And maybe it was too short a time between the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany, and for them to really have a kind of any kind of systematic transition.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you know how Scowcroft responds to the book itself or to the particular criticisms that you raised? So with regard to Yugoslavia or to Afghanistan, in your discussions and debates, was there pushback? Does he come to share your view that these were not perhaps the best moments? Or does he stick to his earlier views?
No, Vietnam too, he kind of, there he sticks to, partly to his view that Congress caused the war, which is kind of I think it's kind of taking the sort of the symptom for the cause, or caused the end of the war. But no, for the most part, I would present him with information or with a question about something, and he conceded on Yugoslavia, on the Panama coup, on the end of the Cold War, on Yugoslavia, that these were that they mishandled stuff. So he was very candid. He was very, I think, upfront about it.
Thank you. Dane. Here, make this faster.
Dane Kennedy from the National History Center. For someone who is such an inside player and presumably so discreet, the op-ed that Scowcroft wrote about Iraq and that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk was sort of startling, I think, for a lot of people. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, sort of how that his view of the issue fit into his larger strategic vision, and also what kind of impact that op-ed had on his subsequent relationship with people who he was very close with before that, I assume.
Yeah, I think it's a pivotal event. I mean, in some ways, as I begin the book, it's really contrary to his personality about being behind the scenes, and we know that he's very close to 41, and so, I mentioned about all his colleagues and friends working under 43. So why would he do this? And this was actually, he'd been on television twice expressing these same perspectives. He'd actually written other op-eds for the Washington Post and after 9/11 in October and early October 2001 and then early 2002. So his position was well known by the White House. And the reason why he wrote it and why he writes these op-eds, I mentioned he's written about 100 over the course of his career, is that he thinks there's a voice missing. So if he thinks that there's a debate that is incomplete, or that for whatever reason, or there's options yet to be explored, or there's some perspective that's needed, then he'll weigh in. But usually he doesn't need to do that. Usually he has enough contacts and people in the administration, or whatever administration there is, or that they're covering those issues already. So he'll only weigh in if he feels it's called for. So there's kind of this quality control, as it were, that he's doing. Now, what effect this had is it really instantly made him hated by the Republicans and a persona non grata in the administration. And it was a very difficult period for him. He didn't really say this exactly, but kind of alluded to that, and other people I talked to did too. And it was very awkward. But how it came about was I spent some time on this because it's pretty interesting, because people say, oh, this is George H.W. Bush put Scowcroft up to that. And that's not the case. The case was that they were in very close touch, Bush and Scowcroft. They knew each other's minds, but it was Scowcroft who gave an appearance on Meet the Press, I think it was, with Bob Schieffer, and his colleague and partner in the Scowcroft group, Arnie Cantor, saw this and said, hey, that's pretty good, you ought to write it up. So he wrote it up and sent it to the Wall Street Journal. They said, we'll run it. So apparently knowing that, he faxed a copy to the senior Bush, faxed a copy to Connie Rice, and then it ran, and she got on the phone with him and yelled at him, and he says he got taken to the woodshed and denied knowing about his position, which was not the case. And so, yeah, it made things very difficult. But what's interesting, though, is that he later on was in support of the surge, even though he opposed the war. He said, well, where are we now, and what do we need to do? And in this situation, we can't withdraw, so we need these more troops. So, and then in the second term, he worked very closely with Rice, with Hadley, who he was close to. And then when Gates came in after after the 2006 elections, he worked very closely with Gates. And so you have this guy who's been sort of rejected and spurned, but despite that, he keeps, he stays pretty unflappable, and then works for the administration in subsequent years. And so which to me just suggests kind of just how, secure he was. He didn't, he doesn't read his own press. He, in answer to a question about the book, a friend of his read it and said, or had started it and said he liked it, but he hasn't read it yet, and I don't think he doesn't read his own press. He's very, maybe that's his military discipline, or something. Yeah.
Does this expose a deeper rupture within Republican foreign policy circles? I mean, you say he sort of this division, opposition early on, and then sort of he comes back in. Is that a reflection of the fact that the neoconservatives had less influence later on? I mean, could you flesh out sort of where the different groups within the Republican foreign policy lie in this issue?
Well, he says that he calls himself a rhino now, Republican in name only. So he's, and in fact, even though he was closer to Kerry than or Obama on foreign policy, he supported the Republicans, at least nominally supported the Republicans, because he felt he had to. But he wouldn't endorse McCain in 2008 because of so many of his advisors were neocons. And so he thought, he has this combination of sort of dove and hawk. He believes in a strong defense and having clear sanctions and sort of and the use of military force and intelligence, covert actions, things like this. But at the same time, he's a dove in the sense that he believes in dialogue, whether it's with I mentioned whether it's with the PLO or with Iran or with formerly Red China. He believes in negotiation, and so he believes in sort of that an international system is better by people and forces having conversations and talking to each other, rather than, because they have to live together. And that's kind of what they found out with the Soviet Union and Bataan and with China, is that, look, we're on this planet together, we all have these weapons, and we got to find ways to coexist, and you can't coexist without talking to people and staying in touch. So.
Back here against the wall. Wait one moment till the microphone gets to you. Thanks.
The John Lewis Gaddis biography of Kennan went deeply into his character and personality and interconnected it with his political and other activities. What's the deepest insight into Scowcroft that you can connect with his, his contribution to American foreign policy and American politics?
At one point, he said to me, "There's, I mean, this gets to a sort of dedication to the nation. Maybe it's the duty on our country of West Point, but his dedication to the United States, his patriotism, and his combined with his discipline." And so he told me once. He says, "There's no reason ever to be selfish." And I thought, wow. And I said, "Well, what about when you get sick?" And he said, "Well, okay." But to think that, I mean, he really is a wonk in terms of foreign policy and national security. This is what consumes him and interests him, and it's what he thinks about, and it's what he enjoys talking about in his off hours with his deputy Bob Gates, or after they left office. And so I think really is this how he's I think quite exceptional in that regard, quite exceptional, and really a kind of an extreme case, if you will, in terms of political science terms or social science terms, that he's not representative of most people. I mean, so you have this kind of his background where he's he doesn't really seek material goods, although he's done very well. He's doesn't need to be a social player like Kissinger is. He's kind of just happy to, or so completely dedicated on the United States, and a believer in a way that maybe is a little bit old-fashioned, but I think is kind of consistent with growing up in Ogden in Utah and having this a community that came from all over Western Europe and all over the United States into this area to have a community of believers and reach a degree of material success.
Control of his ego.
Hi, I'm James Wilson from the State Department. I work on the Foreign Relations series, so I'm really enjoyed reading this wonderful book. I had a question just about the relationships between Bush and Baker and Bush and Scowcroft, and then sort of the three of them together. There was a line that caught my interest on page 493. You say that during the 92 campaign, that Scowcroft is the one who asks Baker to come back to run the campaign. And you say Bush couldn't ask his friend directly. He'd then be conceding he needed Jim's help. I find that weird. I mean, I know, obviously, I mean, it just seems like a weird thing to me. And it also gets back at, we get into 89, suddenly, Scowcroft is Bush's best friend, Baker is Bush's best friend. There are other very competitive people in this administration, and it does seem to work, 89, 92, whereas in previous iterations, there's this, tension between these different principles that can cause really huge problems. I just wondered, how do you think, what is the relationship between Scowcroft, Baker, and Bush in 89, 92? Are we remembering it as maybe a more rosy situation over time? I wonder if that came out in talking with Scowcroft and others.
Well, I think it's a complex relationship. It was, on the first point about why Bush would ask Scowcroft to ask Baker about him coming from the State Department to help the campaign, I think they were intensely competitive. I mean, Baker kind of always thought he would be a better president and could do better, and Bush would joke back at him, well, if you're so smart, how come you're not president? and they had rivalries, and over tennis, and they're both kind of these exuberant Texans. But Baker was he's always very he's very ambitious, immensely capable, very charismatic. In a way, probably more so in some ways than anyone else in the administration, and several people have said as much. And Scowcroft was completely different. Scowcroft didn't really care if he looked rumpled or didn't care about how he came across. He would never deign to leak anything or think he knew the president's mind. And so I think they were both best friends with the president, but they had a very different basis for their relationship. I mean, Scowcroft was, in some ways, there was always an element of the staff officer there. There was always the subordinate officer who was helping out his principal or his superior to undertake some task. And then to undertake that task as well as one could will be to take their own project in your mind and wrestle with that project and figure out, okay, this is what you need to do, but all because you're working for your principal. So I think there was this selflessness, this lack of ego that I think that was missing with Baker. So they're both best friends, but different kinds of best friends. And what's interesting is that Scowcroft wrote his where's my clicker? He wrote his I'm going to go back to the book title. Oh, sorry about this. There we go. He wrote the book with Scowcroft, not with Baker, not with Nick Brady, not with not with Dan Quayle, and Scowcroft was the only one of his friends who would buy a condo or move up to be around Kennebunkport with former President Bush at Walker Point. So there was kind of a real. I mean, they really, several people talk about how they just adored each other. They really just I think they complement each other in a way that Baker and Bush complement each other in other ways.
If they first meet, Bush and Scowcroft,
is when Bush was head of the Republican National Committee before he was ambassador to the UN, and they got to know each other, I guess, at meetings and stuff. And then they worked closely when Bush was liaison to China. This is in the 74, 75. And so he was, of course, as Kissinger's deputy. But really, as soon as you have to remember that he's Kissinger's deputy national security advisor. But from September 73 on, when Kissinger becomes Secretary of State, Scowcroft is de facto national security advisor. And he's now he's deferential to, and Kissinger was still often leading foreign policy, but in terms of making the government run and figuring out what shape policies would exactly take, this was typically Scowcroft. As I said, there's really a partnership there. So that's, yeah.
Right up here on the left side of the table.
Larry Altman at the Wilson Center. I believe you said that Scowcroft was in the Nixon administration head of the military operations, including the medical office. Did he have anything to say about Nixon's health or drinking or any of?
He did say that he just said that Nixon wasn't a heavy drinker, but when he drank, it affected him a lot. And he would tell stories about when he would get more depressed and more reclusive as Watergate worsened, and that he would sort of just hold him up by himself and maybe invite Kissinger to have a steak with him or something. But then late at night, he would give Scowcroft bizarre orders that Scowcroft would ignore the next morning. And so there was a little bit. I mean, he didn't see, again, he's very discreet and protective, and for the most part, got along well with Nixon, came to see a side of Nixon that we don't see. I mean, I talk about this in the book a little bit, about how there was a Dr. Jekyll side to Nixon, but it was when he wasn't feeling threatened or insecure, but most situations made him feel threatened or insecure. But there were occasions when he wasn't.
Yeah, but and there were other stories also that he would order nuking sending out the nukes, and the defense secretary said he wouldn't take the calls and would take them the next morning.
Yeah, I think Haig and Kissinger said that put out the word that in the last months that the military wasn't to take orders from the president. Yeah.
Another question on a different. Did you his comments about Cheney being a different person? Did you get into his theories as to why he changed personality?
Yeah, I talked about that a little bit. I mean, I don't know the exact reason. I think I'm convinced that it wasn't just Cheney's conservatism, because he's always been a conservative and always been sort of a believer of strong executive power and of presidential discretion. So I think it may have been something like perhaps like a federal judge or Supreme Court justice when you're in power, then you in your absolute position that maybe Lord Acton's corruption of power that. On the other hand, not on the other hand, but another theory, and I think this is possible, is we know that heart surgery and heart attacks can affect people's personality. This is a sort of a medical fact. I think there's a name for it. And so it's possible that he was a little bit a somewhat slightly different person after some of these incidents than he was, or one particular incident, than beforehand. Because what happened, what prompted this discussion were really two things. One was when he was doing this intelligence review, which was just before 9/11 and then continues on afterwards. He makes some recommendations to Cheney, and Cheney is really just dismissing the men at hand and not being intellectually honest and not being kind of practical in a way that he was as defense secretary, not as he was as minority leader in Congress, and that was kind of different because he's always been, he was trained to be a PhD, he doesn't get his doctorate, but he'd always but seemed to be kind of a straight shooter, and yeah, he's kind of very quiet, keeps himself, but always with some integrity, and Scowcroft found with this how he handled this intelligence, where they had a view about reforming the intelligence community because it wasn't doing very well in over the Clinton years, both morale and also that was arranged for the Cold War, which is now over. So that was one incident. Another was just kind of the lead up to the Gulf War, how that was being handled, about this information about Niger yellow cake and about the WMDs and so forth. And he was spinning and he was cooking. He was looking like a bad lawyer, trying to get whatever facts he could to make his case. And this was unlike his earlier behavior. And I don't know exactly what the explanation is, but this is what it was. It wasn't his conservatism or his decision to act. It was his character and personality as a decision maker that had changed. And actually, one follow-up is the proximate calls was a comment by a Princeton academic about you need to hit the Arabs with a thick stick between the eyes or something like this effect, and that Cheney sort of was mouthing these sentiments, and that, I mean, yeah, sure, sometimes you want to use force and make sure that people know that there are serious consequences to actions, but to think that this is kind of a policy prescription and that Cheney was repeating, he seemed to be, kind of racist and unhelpful. So.
Gentleman right next to you, right down there.
Sam Wells here at the center. Let's go back to a comment that you made about the end of the Cold War and General Scowcroft not feeling so comfortable with the New World and its disorder. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned about his feelings toward Europe? Because in a number of conversations I had with him in the 90s, when the Europeans were pushing for greater unification, they were working on the Maastricht Treaty, they were starting to set up a European defense organization. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was absolutely opposed to all of that. It was NATO had to be our principal instrument for dealing with Europe. You deal with the countries individually, you don't deal with the EU, etc. So that would seem to be an attitude from the Cold War that just carried over and didn't change.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, when I looked at sort of why was German reunification under NATO so critical, in fact, we really shouldn't call it German reunification. We should call it German reunification under NATO, because that was the key point. And from what I read it in all candor, is that NATO, rather than having a separate Western European Union or a Franco-German alliance or something rather than that. But NATO allowed the United States to have dominant influence, and this is what they wanted. And I think arguably you could say, well, this is kind of an impetus for NAFTA, was the pending Maastricht Treaty and knowing that Germany would be unified in fear of a European trade group. And so, yeah, I think and he also said this in other ways, that Europe, he saw Europe and the United States having shared philosophic and cultural roots since the 17th century, and really said he thought that they were in some ways kind of the, I think the United States is the natural leader of the world, and that Europe would be a partner in this, and a necessary partner. And I think NATO gave the United States room to have a dominant influence.
On this side of the table, up here. Up here. Thanks.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Do you discuss, did he talk about the NSC system as he ran it as National Security Advisor, and in particular any views of the people that worked for him? As you mentioned, one of them was rather unhappy with him later. Just wonder about that part of it.
So I'm sorry, I missed which part of
the NSC system,
right?
And how both does he talk about that? Do you discuss that, how he ran that, and then in particular any views of his the people who worked for him in the NSC, on the NSC staff?
Their views of him, or vice versa?
Vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah, his views of them.
Okay. Yeah. The NSC system, yes, a large part of the book, and one of the things actually I asked myself is, well, why would a political scientist be writing a biography? That's kind of just from going to from the general to the particular, and it's kind of antithetical to social science to be writing a biography. And one of the things that I realized, and this is an answer to your question, is that this really gave me a handle on issues that I was interested in exploring, is how do we organize national security, and how does the interagency process work, and how do you juggle the State Department, the Treasury, intelligence agencies, White House, political motives, media relations, economics, all the things that factor into national security, and how this can vary so dramatically between administrations. And here was someone whose career spanned several of these administrations, so it allowed me leverage on this. So yes, I talk a lot about the NSC system and about what he learned under Ford. And one of the things that when he comes in and takes over from Nixon as now security advisor, he quickly changes things. He improves morale in the staff, hires women, gives them White House mess privileges, starts having regular meetings with them, and he's just much kinder. He says, well, you can get a lot more out of people if you kind of are nice to them rather than yelling at them all the time, and they'll be more willing to put in the long hours and do the work that's needed. So yeah, there was this different style. He had a certain style for management, which meant delegating and using what talent he could. And so from his NSC, he had a lot of academics. He had policy people. He had, of course, some people from the State Department and other agencies. And he was kind of a mentor to Gates, who still is very close to, was a mentor to Rice, of course, Condoleezza Rice, a mentor to Hadley, a bunch of others. And so in some ways, there's kind of this continuation of Kissinger to Scowcroft, and then with a lot of subsequent top officials. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, but yeah, but he was very attentive to this. And one of the things that the National Security Advisor is able to do is able to figure out, okay, how are we going to make decisions, and at what level, and how is that going to work? And I mean, you can't. Some would say the current administration is micromanaging a 370-person NSC, that they're doing too much of the actual substance that the State Department or Defense Department or other agencies should be doing. And they had a very lean staff, and they wanted one, of course, where there was this camaraderie and general pretty good trust, despite the competition between Baker and Scowcroft. And they were kind of suspicious over their plans about reunification of Germany at the end of the Cold War. But despite that, they were able to work and have this lean organization and really include, and so work pretty directly with the different agencies and their deputies. And then whereas if you don't do that, then then the Defense or State Department are disaffected, or you get cross-cutting policies and so forth. So yeah, it's something that was very important, and I spent a lot of time on.
Absolutely.
A number of the historians of the end of the Cold War, 89, 90, are critical of the pause, the long, as they see it, long review period of Bush 1, trying to figure out how to approach all that that's going on in Europe.
Right.
Is Scowcroft key to that? I mean, are you able to illuminate, why this pause lasted so long, and was if it did, and was Scowcroft sort of instrumental in that deliberation?
Yeah, he's a big part of it. I mean, one of the things, there are several prongs to it. One is that, like many administrations, even ones from the same party, they are intent on distinguishing themselves from their predecessors. But more than that, more importantly, they really thought that with the meetings in Reykjavik and with this new detente that Gorbachev and Reagan seemed to be having, they thought this was going down the wrong direction. They weren't quite sure what the end game was, and they're also very worried that, okay, we seemingly have this betteration and better relations, and Gorbachev is saying the right things, but at the same time, the Soviet Union was supporting Afghanistan, supporting Cuba, El Salvador, Angola, Cambodia. There are lots of places around the world. It hadn't renounced the revolution to overthrow capitalism, hadn't done anything to reform its economy. I mean, yes, there's talk of perestroika, and there was, so you think about, and nothing had been done with their conventional and nuclear forces, so you think about what makes the Cold War, the ideology and the military forces and the foreign policy, none of this had really changed. And so when they came into office, they realized that with Hungary and Poland, what was going on, thanks in some ways to Lech Walesa and what was started there, in some ways this is the credit due to the Reagan administration. They realized, though, that they hadn't done anything about the things that they really cared about, which was about the possibility of nuclear warfare and about actually having new kinds of regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And so they developed in that period, they had a series of, ended up being 6 different talks. They gave one in Hamtramck in Detroit. They gave one at College Station. They gave a couple in the Boston area at the Coast Guard Academy. They gave one in Germany. They gave the talks. They kind of laid out the steps they wanted to take. They decided that they wanted to meet and have a summit with Gorbachev only when they're ready, and they kind of had a bold vision in place and say, okay, here's Gorbachev's speeches about how he wants to reform Soviet society and how he wants, he believes in democracy and doesn't believe in, doesn't want to, it says he's not going to have a Tiananmen solution to protests. Well, if he's saying these things, how then do we actually get to affect these in ways that matter and do this in a way that doesn't provoke a crackdown against Gorbachev and his advisors in the Soviet Union, or provoke other kinds of conflict in Eastern Europe? And that was kind of why it took a long time to kind of really to work this out.
Right up here.
I'm Stanley Falk. Did you discuss with him anything about the Pacific, about our relationship, our alliance with Japan, our relationship with China?
Yeah, I spent about 3 chapters on China. I mean, China is pretty important. I mean, there's for the first time, the administration visits China before it visits Europe because of Hirohito's funeral in February 1989. And as for Japan, he doesn't have, because the U.S.-Japan relationships were so established, he said it was one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult relationship in terms of understanding the Japanese, and they're just very different worldviews and views of sort of hierarchy and democracy and so forth. But he also said that it was a very good relationship, and then what mattered for him was really the strategic side and cooperating on intelligence and nuclear weapons and so forth. And he wasn't concerned really at all about the threat about Hollywood being taken over or the value of real estate or all the things of kind of the Japan scare that was happening that you may remember in the late 80s and early 90s. And this didn't really bother him at all because he saw the security thing as most important, and that was fine. And those other issues were so developed that went to lower levels of the State Department or the Treasury or Commerce and so forth. So he didn't really spend a lot of time handling Japan. Now, in terms of China, we talked a good bit about China because it was this time you have Tiananmen Square, and there's huge outrage in college campuses. Many of you probably no doubt remember in Washington, around the country, in Congress, about what had gone on and how the administration was reacting. And their view was, well, we cannot wreck this relationship, that we have to keep going. And they kind of really bent over backwards. They really went the extra mile to not alienate China. And later on, they were able to use that relationship to have China not veto some of the UN resolutions for the war against Iraq. But he's also, I think, they're aware of China. They're aware that I think they were kind of very. I think he viewed democracy and kind of reform in China as an indirect product. That is to say, that they thought that, well, if there is economic growth and there is more that with that and more openness and globalization, more involved Chinese economy, that political reform will come. And he thought that for the United States or other countries to be more exhortatory, to be more otherwise more to be louder on these issues would be sort of counterproductive. And I think they're also aware that there's a huge market there too. I think there was an element of practical there that they could lose to Japan and Europe, but I think there was mixed motives. But they didn't want another cultural revolution. They didn't want a new bamboo curtain or something, and so they're really concerned about how things could go south if they didn't keep things open to China, and realized that China had very good historical reasons to resent the West and to resent the United States.
The picture that emerges in your talk is of a man who is patriotic, hardworking, disciplined, efficient, and decent. You also used a phrase, moral clarity of the Cold War. It was in this period that Scowcroft thrived the most. But the notion of the moral clarity of the Cold War, one could question. Maybe at 40,000 feet it looks pretty clear. If you're in the weeds, it's a little bit muckier. You mentioned the family jewels in the mid-'70s. There's the Church Committee hearings. Fast forward into the 1980s. You mentioned the Iran-Contra situation. And if you look at the Cold War in Central America and in Africa, the human debris is massive. Where does he stand on these issues, or how does he reflect? Is this just so much collateral damage because this is about right and wrong? Does he have thoughts about these things, and if so, what's his take?
Well, I think in that sense, he really is a kind of this also gets a point of strategist, and I don't dwell on it very much, but if need be, he was prepared to be ruthless. I mean, he kind of signs off on East Timor and Indonesian government, and he supports Vietnam, and there's a lot of things I think but I think it's so it is kind of the priority of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, but there's also, I think, awareness of kind of the limits of American power, and that you have to be. So he's kind of very cautious. You have to be very careful about where the United States intervenes and when it acts, and so he is inclined to be a little more. He would act on occasion, or did agree with certain actions, like obviously the Iraq example, other occasions, but he's. he's kind of modest, and so that's where he differs from the neo-Wilsonians or some of the neoconservatives or some of the people now really clamoring for the United States with troops on the ground and so forth.
Up here, Amanda.
Bones from the National History Center. You've talked a lot about Scowcroft's admirable personal qualities, so it seems that one way to gauge his effectiveness as a statesman is to ask whether or not he's been able to be influential as a role model in encouraging other people to be willing to listen, to reevaluate, and so on. So I wonder, with his mentees, has he been able to encourage any of those behaviors, or in the community more generally?
Yeah, I think to the extent with Hadley and Gates, for sure. I think also he's been very active in programs with students and interns at his own firm, but especially at the Atlantic Council, but also with the Aspen Strategy Group. And he's established sort of fellowships at the Scowcroft with the School of Diplomacy, I think it's called, at the Bush School in A&M. So there is certainly that. Now, what effect they've had so far, it's hard to know, and I don't really explore that. But I do know that feels very fortunate to have lived the life he has, and feels that he has to pass these down. And he has one daughter and one granddaughter, and so he's kind of intent on trying to nurture, especially at the Aspen Strategy Group, the Atlantic Council, and getting sort of people and mentoring them. Now, I think most of these people are probably still fairly young, maybe the 40s tops, with maybe the exception of the Hadleys and Gateses. But yeah, there is some of that, absolutely. But it's too early to tell, maybe, is the answer.
And this is our last question here in the back against the wall.
Hey, Tyler Vandegrift, Shia Rights Watch. You talked a little bit about how he thought, or the conditions that he thought that extremism and terrorism sort of come about, or they're, I forget the word. But could you talk a little bit about his thoughts on extremism, or how it comes about?
Yeah, I didn't really talk to him about that. Well, I really didn't talk about the roots of that. I came to that in one of my concluding comments because of his belief in tackling these problems indirectly, and that certainly I think he would see that if there's some great problem out there, that you'd want to have a multiple-pronged effort, and then you'd want to have force, but you'd want to have clear repercussions, and so deterrence, but you'd also want to find ways to have potable water and create jobs and do those things too. Because a lot of these things, as we know from Jared Diamond's works and others, a lot of these are conflicts that get to conflicts over resources. They're just not about peoples and cultures. So there's so that's kind of extrapolating a little bit, but I think he would look sort of holistically at this problem and realize that, yes, we have to, as I was saying, you have to make the population among whom extremists or terrorists are residing, to make that less hospitable and make that less of a viable option.
I unfortunately have to bring this to a close now, but you can join us afterwards for a conversation and a reception outside this room. The book is available for purchase and I suspect signing as well. I would invite you all to come back next week when Heather Cox Richardson of Boston College will be speaking on March 2nd on her new book, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. My thanks to our audience and thanks to Professor Sparrow for a very, very engaging talk.
Thank you.
Book TV is on Twitter and Facebook.